Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this seminar organised by the Public Sector Committee. Just like to introduce myself. For those who don't know me, I'm Colette Kane, and I'm the current chair of the Public Sector Committee. Our committee has a number of members from both local and central government representing health, higher education, economy, and also members from private sector who work with the public sector. We are very keen to expand our remit and to expand our offering to you and to be able to be more relevant to our public sector members. And therefore, I do have an ask today from you. I would like you to input to the Q&A box any topics or any things that you think would be of relevance and that you think we could potentially have a seminar or something on. Also, if you have any ideas about speakers, please put those in the Q&A box too. We're really, really grateful for any contributions, and we'll certainly act on those going forward. Then just in terms of our future seminars, just a date for your diary, the 22nd of June is our next seminar, again a lunchtime event, and the title of that is Skills for a New World. It's very, very relevant at the minute because Northern Ireland are producing a skills strategy, and we'll be talking about that and where the gaps are in skills. As you know, over the last 15 months, there's been new skills required from us all, indeed. And this seminar is really relevant for anyone who wants to look at their skills and develop those skills, and also for anyone who has children who's interested in being able to guide them appropriately. So I do encourage you very much to come along to that one on the 22nd of June. And now for our main event, and I'm really happy to introduce to you Darran Byrne from Deloitte Ireland. And Darran is the operational lead is the lead for the operational risk and resilience team within Deloitte. And he is talking today on operational resilience and the operational resilient framework, which I'm really interested to hear too. So if you have any questions, anything that strikes you during the presentation, please again put it into the Q&A box, and Darran will take questions at the end and be happy to answer those as best he can. So it's over to you, Darran.
Thanks very much, Colette. So thanks for the introduction, and delighted to be here. And we can get started. So if we take a look at the agenda, what I hope to cover in the session is defining operational resilience. I guess it's somewhat of a hot topic across all sectors. And one that maybe people are struggling to understand what is operational resilience. So we might start with that, looking at that kind of movement towards a resilient posture and what's the shift in mindset and culture that's required. We'll move on into the kind of characteristics of an effective kind of operational resilience culture. Likewise, looking at the framework itself and the underpinning capabilities. And then what might be the steps that you could take to further enhance your organization from an operational resilience perspective. So I'll just move forward into the first slide. So we look at defining operational resilience. I guess up to recently, you know, the main operational risks that organizations face resulted from vulnerabilities relating to the rapid adoption of technology and dependency on technology infrastructure, as well as a growing reliance on critical services from third parties. And your customer or market demands for always been on kind of 24/7 access to products and services, which requires a higher level of availability, security, and reliability. The pandemic has obviously landed in the last 15 months and brought a lot of change and challenges to organizations. And I guess in respect of this, it's exacerbated kind of some of these operational risks, increased the economic and business uncertainty. It's brought about kind of disruption to information services, personnel, facilities, and relationships with third parties and your customers. In addition, cyber threats are something that's kind of spiked. And of course, we've seen something more recent and very topical in the HSE in Ireland, and the impact that that's had on the health service as a whole. So it's definitely something that's very relevant at the moment. If we look to try and defining operational resilience, it's focused on the ability of an organization to sustain important business services. And this is something that I'll get into later on, but there's a shift in mindset in terms of focusing on business services rather than processes or activities. And that's sustaining important business services during both normal business conditions and major operational disruptions without causing considerable harm to your customers or your external kind of stakeholders, the wider market or operating environment in which you participate in, and to the organization itself. I suppose one of the shifts, and we'll get onto it in the next slide, that we're seeing around operational resilience is not just the focus on kind of responding and planning, but it is also looking towards preventative measures in terms of you're avoiding significant operational disruptive events. Why is it, I suppose, so topical at the moment? Organizations are facing a number of kind of different kind of challenges, and how they're structured as well, and their operating models lend itself to the topic. So if we go through some of these items, so organizations are becoming more digitally enabled. So digitalization is increasing the underlying complexity of technology and the dependency to it. Increased outsourcing of key components. So organizations are increasingly depending on third-party providers to operate critical components of their business services. And absorbing operational disruptions of third parties becomes challenging if they're not understood. And again, with COVID landing, we've seen a lot of disruption from a third-party perspective, where organizations didn't necessarily have a full view of the contingency planning of their third-party suppliers, and third parties, that's service providers that support them with their critical services, and therefore resulted in some form of outage for a period of time. We're also, again, seeing that increased sophistication of attacks. So the frequency, intensity, sophistication of cyber attacks has increased dramatically in recent years. In particular, protection against cyber attacks has become more challenging for organizations to implement. Demand from customers and their expectations. So in the digital age, higher customers, end users' expectations with regard to 24/7 availability of services and products. And they've become more sensitive to service disruption and reliability issues. If we look at it from a natural disaster perspective, there's more severe natural disasters and extreme weather events. Shifts in climate change has caused kind of extreme natural events across the globe, and that's something that organizations need to be mindful of and ensure they're fully prepared. Participating in complex ecosystems. So organizations are increasingly participating in complex ecosystems. Their ability to provide services has become reliant on other interdependent participating parties whose operational resilience is sometimes unknown, and that can have that detrimental or knock-on impact on the services that you're providing. What we've seen, I suppose, on a global scale is, organizations are experiencing higher volume of incidents with significant operational disruption. And with that comes increased focus from governments, politicians, regulators, external stakeholders to ensure that organizations that are supporting their agenda and their providing services are improving and focused on their operational resilience. And one that is we stumble upon quite frequently is that organizations are facing aging infrastructure and technology debt, and which is resulting in inevitable application and equipment breakdown and hardware outages. If we look at the shift that we've seen from your traditional business continuity to operational resilience and what that looks like, at the highest level, the operational resilience is focused more on anticipation, prevention, adaptation, and moving away from the traditional business continuity concepts that focus on reactive recovery. And again, embedding and trying to implement and embed a more operational resilient organization or regime will require a shift in mindset and a cultural change. Organizations will need to adopt a more business service led approach and consider risks more broadly across the organization. Assume that severe disruptions will happen. And I guess the big shift is business continuity was more focused on if rather than when, and that shift in mindset needs to happen when we're looking at operational resilience. And then it's top-down support, so it's leadership from the board or the executive or the senior management team to drive this agenda across the organization. So if we look at the business continuity side and what we've seen in the past and limitations, so it's more reactive in nature, heavily focused on physical events, designed and tested in organizational silos. And the organizational silos piece is really focused on the fact that business continuity tends to be focused more on business processes rather than business services, and often becomes a static initiative that rarely gets updated. And indeed, we've seen a lot of this actually happen, particularly when COVID landed, where organizations either didn't have appropriate kind of plans in place, or where they did have plans, they actually hadn't been reviewed in a number of years. They had become redundant in that business area had moved on, and people had moved on, and in fact they weren't able to invoke their plan in any way. And it's also limited in scope in terms of not just the physical events, but a lot of organizations will have said that a pandemic wasn't on their radar, or it may have been considered on a long list, but then wasn't brought forward as a short list, and therefore weren't as prepared as they could have been. And then testing exercises. So where testing is conducted around your business continuity plans and framework, that those have become more rudimentary and designed to show compliance. Whereas the move to a resilient posture has clear benefits. So it's more proactive in its ability to adapt to unforeseen events and emerging threats. It strengthens the resilience to disruption, incidents, and attacks across all operational resilience domains, including technology, data, third parties, facilities, operations, and people. It strives for a seamless transition to BCP mode without interruption, and you'll see some of the core components of that helps that transition as we move forward in the presentation, and then focuses on the most critical end-to-end business services, crossing those organizational silos. Again, if we look at the business service focus, what is a business service versus a process? So I suppose a business service is looking at the outcome expected by your end user, your customer, your external stakeholders in terms of what has been delivered to them by the organization. It's the end-to-end visibility to critical business services, the outcomes, the products, the services delivered to the customers. Whereas the processes, the business process that we may have been focused on through business continuity, they are the tactical component required to actually complete or deliver that service. So you'll find that there's a number of processes that underpin your service that you're providing, and those processes are jotted across maybe multiple functions across your organization. And in that way, you need to have a holistic view of your end-to-end business services, mapping out those core processes and looking at kind of together along with your supporting kind of applications, systems, third parties, locations, data, and people. Moving forward and looking at kind of the key characteristics around a more operational resilient organization, I suppose what's going to support you on that journey. You really do need to look at that senior level of sponsorship. And again, it's considering the importance of operational resilience across the organization with the expectation of external stakeholders, sponsorship from your board, your governing body, your executive management. And that is key to successfully delivering an effective and robust operational resilience program, that top-down kind of drive And the next piece around a clearly defined strategy and having a robust and effective governance structure as well. So clear roles and responsibility across the organization to support the Operation Resilience agenda. A dedicated function driving the topic, and it's not necessarily a function, but it may be an individual or a role. So you may already have a risk coordinator or a chief risk officer in your organizations, and that might be a natural place for this role to reside. But ultimately, it is someone that is, or a function that is going to drive the operational resilience agenda, ensuring that that change is embedded and maintaining oversight of all your operational resilience activities, to continue through your end-to-end, from identifying what those business critical services are, to your ongoing kind of monitoring and oversight of those, looking at your impact tolerances, performing the testing and exercising and coordinating that with the relevant kind of stakeholders across the organization, and ultimately, identifying where training needs are required and ensuring that people across the organization are indeed trained and raise awareness around your operational resilience agenda and what you're trying to, ultimately, what you hold of most value and what you're trying to protect. Again, that integrated cross-functional approach, which we've mentioned, trying to break down those silos. So in a traditional BCP, you're looking at the processes across individual business areas, and they will be planned for and tested at a business area by business area. Whereas this is looking at your business services, which may have a number of different business processes supporting that or underpinning that service across different areas. So it is that integrated approach to resilience. Again, we talk about the mapping of your business services. So understanding the core components underpinning your services. So it's your processes, your people, your infrastructure, the third parties. Then we look at being trained and prepared. So what does an organization need to do to ensure that they're fully, they have an effective operational resilience program? So it is around training, preparing. If we look at your kind of business continuity planning, it is around continuous testing of your plans and scenarios that you've adapted and identified as kind of key vulnerabilities and threats, and ensuring that those scenarios are tested through workshops or however you go about it, and the lessons that are taken from those workshops are embedded back into those kind of business continuity plans, and to further enhance your operational resilience. And ultimately, it's looking to provide that level of agility and capacity to adapt and respond, and leading to a culture of being more proactive and responsible. If we look at kind of key elements of your operational resilience framework, we talk about kind of supply chain and outsourcing risk and mitigating measures around that. So in terms of supply chain and outsourcing, how do you effectively monitor and manage those outsource relationships? Do you have line of sight of their contingency planning and their op resilience model, to ensure, to get more comfort around the fact that they do have processes in place to maintain a level of resilience against different vulnerabilities and threats around the activities and services that they're providing you? Again, we look at information security, cyber security, and data protection control. Change management protocols is another key area, and something that operational resilience should be considered as part of your change management agenda and program, because ultimately you don't want to stifle innovation, but at the same time you want to ensure that the risks associated with that change management or transformation are identified and managed appropriately. And that is something that I know our colleagues in Switzerland ran a survey probably 2 years ago now, and focused in on 182 significant or material operational disruptions across a number of organizations. And what they identified from that was that of the 182 operational disruptions that they captured in their survey, 90 of those were as a direct result of issues arising from change management or transformation programs. So again, this is a key piece of the puzzle with your operational resilience agenda. Crisis management and communications, again, it's something that should have been part of your business continuity kind of framework and program, but it's something that, you know, is critical in terms of ensuring that you have a robust framework in place. Business continuity, disaster recovery plans, again, they're a key aspect of operation resilience, and it is something that, you know, it's not that business continuity and disaster recovery has been replaced by operation resilience. It's just business continuity is now just a component of operation resilience, along with all the other aspects that we're mentioning here. And then fundamentally, risk management, compliance, audit oversight and assurance, and integrating your risk management, compliance and audit and oversight assurance processes into this operation resilience framework. And again, we would see that if any of these elements are missing or ineffective, it can significantly undermine an organization's ability to recover from a significant disruptive event. And furthermore, understanding and managing the interconnections between the framework elements is critical to embedding a framework that can deliver desired outcomes. So if we look at the operational resilience journey, and I suppose this underpins kind of the core components of your framework, but if we start at the start, we're looking to anticipate and assess. We're looking at determining those critical business services. What will the impact be, and how will we be impacted? Then it's moving on to the planning and preparing. So it's assessing relevant impact importance. So once you've identified your critical business services and you've mapped out your core underlying processes and those interconnectivities with your kind of key areas, technology, people, locations, third parties, data, it is a case of then trying to identify what is the potential impact of these critical services, you know, in terms of if they were to arise on the organization, and try and prioritize those so that it helps the organization then understand where to focus your attention on. So the second phase around assessing relative impact importance is really focused around prioritizing those critical business services and ensuring that you have the necessary focus on the more significant or material ones. Then we look at defining plausible disruption scenarios. And this is probably something that to date has been more of a nice to have in business continuity scenario rather than something that's embedded within all organizations. So what we would have generally see is there might be plans across an organization, but not necessarily tested you know, periodically, and also not taking into account, you know, this type of scenario stress testing and identifying kind of impact tolerances. So how long can you go without the service? So the introduction, I suppose, of impact tolerances is something that is broadly been brought into play here in terms of operation resilience. And if we go into impact tolerance, what are we trying to achieve by setting impact tolerances against your critical business services? Ultimately, your impact tolerance limit is the maximum tolerable level of disruption to an important or critical business service. It's usually measured by a length of time and should reflect the point at which any further disruption to the important service could cause intolerable harm to either your organization, to the customer or external stakeholders that you have, or to the market in which you operate in. So that's ultimately what you're trying to do by identifying those impact tolerance levels. And if we look at our traditional kind of recovery time objectives that we would have set as part of your business continuity, generally we would see your impact tolerance level as something that is beyond your recovery time objective, where you, and this is where the scenario piece comes in around stress testing these tolerances, is to identify where is the breaking point at which it would lead to that intolerable harm on either your own organization, customer, or the market. So that is a key facet of your operational resilience journey. If we look then at the harmonizing response and communication, this is focused on how do you address the problem. And again, the next slide will talk to these in more detail. And finally, it's looking at testing, measuring, and improving resilience. And I think that's something that's really come through in terms of how do you plan for the future. So it's through the testing, through that measurement around your impact tolerances, that you gather that kind of key data, identify areas for improvement and potential investment in terms of addressing kind of any shortfalls or shortcomings in terms of your resilient posture. So, and you'll see more detail around that on the next slide. So if we look at a framework for practical implication, and we look at those kind of key headings again, and what we look to focus on as part of your op resilience framework. If we start at the top, we're looking at those key areas. So we're looking at third parties, we're looking at infrastructure, we're looking at cyber, we're looking at people, we're looking at facilities. These are core to your business services and how they're delivered. So it is looking at the interconnectedness and the interdependencies on all of these. From a governance perspective, definitely clear leadership, clear roles and responsibilities are required to support an operational resilience agenda. And that's something that we find is missing in a lot of organizations, is clear leadership and clearly defined roles and responsibilities that are embedded across the organization. Sometimes they're sitting in a policy or a framework document, but actually haven't really been communicated and embedded. That's something that just needs to, a shift in culture. Again, as part of that kind of framework or policy, you need to outline what are the minimum requirements and controls that are designed, clearly documented and communicated. And again, communication is key in terms of people understanding across the organization what is their role, what's their responsibility in respect of your operation resilience agenda. And then having an assurance framework, and this can come in the form of your internal audit programs, or indeed tie in with maybe some of your compliance oversight programs. If we look at the key capabilities, so we start with anticipate and assess. So again, as we've discussed, it's important business services are identified and endorsed by senior management, and that's key. It's not something that's done in silo in different business areas across your organization. It's done with a view, a top-down view, alignment to your strategy, and endorsed by senior management. Then it's looking at mapping of those operational dependencies. So we talked about your third parties, your infrastructure, your cyber, people, facilities. And then it's looking at high-risk scenarios. Once they're identified and active, looking to provide early warning of emerging an imminent issue or incident or crisis. Moving forward, protecting and controlling. So it's designing standards for resilience that are defined and communicated to all areas of the business, supporting functions and third parties. Preventative measures are in place and documented to strengthen the defenses and reduce the likelihood of disruption to those important business services that you've identified. Then it's the planning and preparing. So it's looking at those impact tolerances in the event of disruption, defining those and ensure that they're communicated to all parties to set the context and direction for planning. It's looking at response, recovery, contingency plans. This is, again, aligning to your business continuity, traditional business continuity, but it's overlaying that, looking at delivering your important services within agreed impact tolerances in the event of disruption. And then again, it's looking to validate those plans. And this is something, as I say, that's probably hasn't been as effective or rolled out as efficiently as it could have been in a number of organizations that we've seen. It's the validation through the testing and exercising. It's key to support the staff and ensure that they're trained for their role. And finally, if and when a major event occurs, you're in the respond and recover strategy. So what are you focused on there? It's having the organizational crisis and function specific incident response arrangements, including escalation protocols, and ensuring alignment across the organization. So again, it's focused on your crisis management, clear roles and responsibilities, who's going to make those key decisions, and how are they going to be communicated. So it is looking to embed a more rapid and agile command center, coordination, communication. And communication is probably something that we've seen through the COVID lens as something that at the outset of COVID was a challenge for organizations. And that's something that this operational resilience framework is looking to kind of support on, to ensure that there is clear communication, not just internally, but externally as well. And then all about that continuous enhancement of your program. So looking at lessons that are learned through post-event reviews on major incidents, crisis and near misses. And finally, if we look at the bottom aspect of your framework, it's looking at that cultural aspect. So as I say, this will require a cultural change, a shift in mindset. So there are other areas. So change management is something that I've mentioned, and operational resilience will need to be a key consideration through change management and decision making. You'll need to, as you become more mature from an op resilience perspective, provide best in class materials, examples of good practice, advice, information on known risks. And it's not just looking internally at your own organization to try and identify any emerging threats, but it's also looking externally and what's happening to your peers, not just in our own country, but elsewhere, that could help you better prepare for potential operational disruption. And finally, it is around that training and awareness. It's giving individuals that have specific roles around operational resilience the tools to be able to conduct their role, but it's also raising awareness across the organization so they understand what you're trying to achieve, the key objectives of your operational resilience framework, what their role and responsibility is in day-to-day activities, and become more familiar with the plans, the key critical business services that you've identified for the organization, the impact tolerance levels, and also I guess the roles and responsibilities that they need to play in terms of if and when a scenario actually arises, so they're better prepared. If we look at kind of questions your organization should look to answer when building your operational resilience into your organizational capabilities, it is looking at things like, what is our risk appetite in relation to our ability to maintain important business services in the event of a severe but plausible operational disruption. And risk appetite is something that is critical and should be the foundations of your risk management framework, in terms of identifying kind of what is your level of appetite to take on certain risks, and articulating that at a senior management and ultimately sign off from your board or executive level on that. What are the actual risks in the underlying complex value chain of important business services, and how are they interrelated? What are the disciplines required for driving operational resilience? And again, that top-down support, breaking down those organizational silos, and ensuring that there's cross-functional integration. How do we pull all this together and establish accountability and ownership across the organization? What do we need to do, and what is really important to us, our customers, and their customers? How do these important business services work from end-to-end perspective? and what are the underlying components, including ecosystems and interdependencies. And that is critical in this instance. It is looking at those underlying components, which are your business processes, but also your wider ecosystems and interdependencies. What weaknesses or vulnerabilities could become a root cause or trigger point for severe disruption of the important service? And again, by trying to identify those weaknesses and vulnerabilities, it's an opportunity to try and work on preventing severe disruption by enhancing your control environment, and being more proactive around that side of things. How and with what do we stop these important services from being severely disrupted? Should they nevertheless be severely disrupted, how can we reduce harm done to our customer or market or other relevant stakeholders? Have we tested those plans to validate they work as expected? And we know that those plans will not execute themselves. How do we respond effectively as an organization and communicate with our stakeholders? And finally, the bit for the continuous improvement of your operational resilience program is around how do we learn lessons from real events and near misses so that we can emerge stronger? How do we make it part of our DNA to ensure that we are doing what we're doing is having a positive impact? And how will the focus of operational resilience transform our approach in managing our suppliers, business partners, operations, technology, cyber, people? And it is looking to that, as I say at the start, that shift in mindset and considering risks more broadly and having that holistic view of your risk profile and your risk landscape. And then ultimately, how do we define and measure success for improving our operational resilience? And finally, if we just move on to the last element, which is focused around kind of 7 key components to focus on and take kind of key takeaways in terms of making your organization, I suppose, more resilient. It is discuss future failure. So it is bringing kind of a breadth of subject matter experts, along with support from senior management and senior stakeholders in your organization to get together and try and identify, kind of ask the what if, ask what next, encourage people to participate in the thinking around what could potentially impact our organization to cause a severe disruptive operational disruption. Consider those connected impacts. So again, considering the connections between 5 capitals, so nature, human, social, your buildings, financial, and understand the potential impact disruption on your stakeholders, your organization, and wider society. It's understanding essential outcomes. So understanding what is important to your stakeholders, to society, to the organization, and identifying kind of those essential outcomes that require a degree of resilience. Defining impact thresholds. So again, we've referenced the thresholds and identifying kind of what are those thresholds for your critical business services or your essential outcomes to determine tolerable limits that should not be breached. And again, where you may have a breach of that kind of impact tolerance level, that is always a trigger that needs immediate remediation to further enhance and make your operational resilience more robust in respect of that particular critical or important business service. It's balancing strategic choices. So making strategic choices about resilience interventions by balancing control, agility, efficiency, and innovation. Stress test thresholds. So conducting stress testing to determine whether you're able to remain within your impact thresholds, irrespective of the threat. And that can include kind of looking at your specific critical business service. How can it be impacted if you ramp up your, add in another threat or vulnerability to that? What might that look like until you get to that breaking point where you fear that actually, do you know what, if we get to this point, we are not going to be able to provide that critical service, and it could potentially cause intolerable harm to either your own organization, to your customer base or external stakeholders, or to the wider society or market. And then enabling adaptive leadership. And this focuses on enabling direction, alignment, and long-term commitment to resilience through a culture of adaptation and empowerment. And I might stop there and allow for any questions at this point.
Thank you, Darran. And yeah, I actually was looking at listening very carefully to what you were saying, but you know, it strikes me that you know, like 15 months ago, people were taking off the shelf the BCP and dusting it down. Yep. And you know, I know a few of the bodies we deal with, they were saying it was actually wasn't what, you know, they had to just bin it really and yep. start thinking on their feet. So to me, what you've been talking about is really, really exciting, because it brings it into that day-to-day, you know, framework and yep. and management. A couple of things that struck me really, you talked about leadership, actually was your last point there, but I'd written it down earlier as well. You know, the roles and responsibilities of the leaders of the board, the executive team, whatever. How do you get buy-in to this process from those people?
Yeah, and I think thanks, Colette. Yeah, no, you're right, and it is a fundamental aspect and a critical aspect of you know, either your traditional business continuity or your operational resilience kind of agenda, is that leadership and accountability, and it is getting that buy-in. And I think what we tend to do when we're working with clients around this particular aspect is hold workshops to initially define a strategy from an organizational perspective, and in that way you're getting them engaged in the process. They're setting the tone for the organization, and that feeds into then identifying those critical or important business services, and through that then it is looking at what can you know, what are the positives or the pros from, you know, embedding this type of operational resilience framework. And it is, again, as you mentioned, the key roles and responsibilities then that underpin that. So once you've got that buy-in from the leadership in terms of driving the agenda, driving the strategy, defining the strategy, it's looking at the wider kind of operating model and key roles and responsibilities. So whether it be, you know, within a business area, that there's a key business process that underpins one of those important or critical business services that you're identifying an owner, and what their role and responsibility might be is defined, and you know, and they can get the necessary training that they require for their particular role. Likewise, as I mentioned, aside from just the leadership aspect and driving this from a top down, you also need someone or a function centrally driving this, because there are a lot of aspects to this, from, you know, particularly the continuous improvement and maintaining this on the agenda of everyone of the organization. You do need someone driving this centrally, otherwise this will fall flat on its feet. So again, it's identifying an appropriate role or a function that already exists, possibly in your corporate services world, or a risk role that can drive this agenda and make sure that, you know, those critical business services that you've identified at your first attempt, that they are reviewed and refreshed on a periodic basis, and particularly if there's any key triggers that might have occurred in the organization, maybe significant operational change, transformation that might shift in terms of what your key or critical business services are. So instead of, you know, waiting for, maybe you've set an annual review process, that might be a trigger to go in and review those there and then. And you need someone centrally to call that out and say, look, this is something we need to do here and now. And again, they need to be driving the agenda from a testing perspective, and trying to, you know, engage across the organization, both from a senior management perspective, but also, as they say, subject matter experts, that you will look at exercising these certain scenarios that could potentially impact on the delivery of those particular critical and important services. So there are key roles to be established. And then broader than that, then obviously we want everyone, involved in the program and aware of the program. So it is a case of ensuring that everyone gets the necessary training. And that is something that we've seen where maybe organizations have gone and developed policies or frameworks, but actually they've sat on a shelf, just like the plans have. Business areas have been sent out a template. They've been asked to go and complete a template around a business continuity plan, but not necessarily given the tools to understand what they're filling out, what they're completing, how to identify those kind of key business, kind of in the traditional BCP world, business processes or activities. And now we're looking to identify those critical kind of business services. So training is another key aspect of that.
Okay, there's a couple of questions have come in then. So does the Audit and Risk Committee need to change the corporate risk register to a more living document rather than a traditional or box ticking structure to one that changes as risks emerge?
Yeah, so look, I think what we would encourage as best practice is that your risk registers are a living and breathing document. So, most organizations have both a bottom-up approach where, business units or functions might have their own risk registers, and the more significant risks across those risk registers would be considered as part of your corporate risk register, along with those risks that could potentially impact on your strategic objectives, achieving those strategic objectives. So usually there's a review set periodically. A lot of organizations, some unfortunately only look at it annually, their risk registers, but others are more proactive in looking at it either semi-annually or quarterly even. But it's definitely something that we've listened to our own clients that we've worked with. And one thing that has come up time and time again is that, albeit they have a corporate risk register, when COVID arrived, they actually developed a COVID risk register to address specific risks related to the there and now. And along with that, there was specific action plans to address certain risks and further mitigate those risks. And they were being tracked and monitored weekly and, in some instances daily. And it was more of a living and breathing document. So I would encourage that, not that you have to go to that level of, looking at your corporate risk register daily or weekly, but, in between your formal periodic reviews, that if and when something new arises or, a new threat emerges, that you do reflect that and bring that, if it's a corporate risk register, that's brought on a senior management agenda or an executive team agenda for discussion and updating and inclusion there and then, and looking at what type of actions we do need to take to further mitigate those particular risks. Because the longer you leave it, the more exposed you become to that risk. And if you haven't taken any actions to further mitigate against that risk, the likelihood of that actually happening or materializing increases. So it is something that, if and when you do identify an emerging threat or risk, that you do kind of think about that, have a discussion at a senior management level, and that will ultimately feed on up through your audit and risk committees for review and challenge. But again, I would say that, that is a question back from the audit and risk committee, to the senior management team or the risk coordinator as to, okay, our risk register, have we considered any new and emerging risks that may have materialized, or come to light over the last period? So definitely something that needs to be focused on.
Okay. Another question then from our attendees. You mentioned making plans for severe but plausible scenarios. I suspect that 18 months ago, we would not have considered a pandemic a plausible scenario. How do you effectively determine what scenarios to test for?
And again, I suppose there's a lot of different sources that you can leverage from both internal kind of data, but also looking at the wider kind of external data as well. So it is collating, as I say, a number of data set points from both external environment and internal environment to try and direct that scenario selection. But again, it should be aligned to kind of those, your I guess the risks that you've identified on your corporate risk registers, what could go wrong, and try and play those scenarios out. Because even if you have a maybe a more narrow focus scenario, if I give you an example of one of clients that we work with, they said that just weeks before COVID landed, they had a 2-hour session with their senior management team or their executive management team to discuss the eventuality of 85% of their staff being unavailable. And I think they put it down to the scenario they came up with was a Christmas party and everyone got food poisoning or something to that extent. And basically 85 to 90% of their staff were unavailable. What would we do? And that 2-hour session, they said, was invaluable when COVID landed, because they had actually discussed a lot of eventualities that actually arose in the first few weeks of COVID landing, which helped them better prepare in terms of what they needed to do and how they might go about it and who might be responsible for different activities as well. So it's definitely something that we would encourage to build into your kind of program. As I say, it is focused, looking at that internal data points and risks, but it's also looking at the wider external landscape and what's happening and what might be relevant to your organization, and selecting from there. You usually start with a longer list of scenarios and then whittle it down to a shorter list, where you might put if you have a shorter list of 6, you might say you'll do 2 or 3 a year kind of thing, and work it through that way.
Okay, got one here in the chat box. So you talk about response and recovery and the importance of change management. Learning from COVID-19 means that we have added reassess to response and recovery. This is to help us reinvent to the new normal, to help drive improvement and meet carbon neutral and new ways of working. How do you recommend we build this into operational resilience? So reassess as well as response and recovery.
Yeah, so I think that the reassess piece is, again, looking at what has happened to date, and taking the lessons learned from that to reevaluating what actions need to be taken to have a more effective and more robust, resilient posture. So it is about kind of taking those lessons learned and building that into what were the challenges that arose through COVID. How did we respond? What can we do better? In a lot of instances, organizations we found didn't have crisis management teams. They ended up setting up specific COVID task forces or task teams that were only mobilized late in the day, and it delayed kind of response to all of that. So it is reassessing, do we need a crisis management team that are there to react to any kind of scenario that might arise and be responsible for that incident management and key decision making around any kind of severe operational disruption. And again, that reassessment is all about ensuring that you are looking more about the preventative nature as well. So again, the responding nature is all about your planning and that side of things. But again, through the lessons that you've learned, are there any new controls that you can put in place to try and ensure that your organization is more robust and stands up more to those kind of challenges, and in that way can even prevent some of these operational disruptions from happening in the first instance. Obviously, something like pandemic is not something that you can necessarily prevent, but other things like maybe a cyber attack, you know, being more resilient around that, or again around, you know, threats to your services from issues with your third parties or outsourced providers. Again, having an effective monitoring and, you know, program around those relationships can prevent certain outages from actually happening or impacting your business by identifying maybe substitutability or alternative delivery models.
Okay, I have, I think we have exhausted the questions now, and I just find that really fascinating. I must say, I have a real interest in risk management anyway, as many people will know, and as I'm sure many of the audience too. But I just, you know, how it all fits in together is really, really fascinating. So thank you so much, Darren.
Brilliant.
And thank you for
very
taking
much.
the time to talk to us today.
Great.
And if anyone has any more ideas or of topics or speakers that they'd like to hear from, please do put those in the Q&A box. Or if you think about it afterwards, if you could just contact the Ulster Society, they'll feed those through to us. The presentation, a few people have been asking this, the slides will be sent out with the recording of the webinar as well. So if you want to go back and listen to it again, or you want to refer it on to colleagues, then that'll be your opportunity. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending, and see you soon. Bye.
Thanks very much.